A common challenge for neurodivergence in social interactions with neurotypicals is this tendency by the neurotypical to try to read feelings, thoughts, and intentions out of everything that the neurodivergent says or does. And a lot of the time, when the neurodivergent isn't masking, camouflaging, or compensating for the neurodivergent traits, they're being very authentic. They're being direct in their communication. There is no subtext. There's no hidden meaning. Unfortunately, a lot of neurotypicals do like to use subtexts and hidden meanings and like to try to read those out of interactions. And they come up against this neurodivergent behaving in what the neurodivergent sees to be a very authentic way, but they're trying to read something else that's not there. So what ends up happening is the neurotypical projects an intention, a motive, a feeling, a thought onto the neurodivergent, and then has a reaction based on that projection. They assume that the neurodivergent is being direct and blunt because they have callous disregard for their feelings, and they assume that the neurodivergent is trying to hurt them or disrespect them. So what happens next? They then have a reaction to that projection. Rather than asking a clarifying question, they create their own projection, and then they react to it. Now, it's true to say that sometimes in the course of being our direct, authentic selves as neurodivergents, we can tread on people's toes socially. We can be unintentionally disrespectful. We can not read the writing on the wall. We can miss things. That all happens. And it's not to disregard the feeling of the person who's on the other end of that social interaction, because maybe a lot of the times what they're feeling is legitimate and deserves to be validated. However, when they do this projection and when they have a reaction to the projection and don't ask any clarifying questions, they go down their own rabbit hole of making broad inferences about us and who we are and what we stand for, and they reach this conclusion seemingly independently of us without consulting us, and then make a judgment, a summary judgment about us. And some people might, quirk an eyebrow and have a, oh, that's funny that this person said this reaction to something we might have said or done. And then they might ask a clarifying question, and that way they completely sidestep that whole process. And then we go, oh, I didn't realize that's how I came across. I didn't realize you read it this way. This is what I actually meant. And then they clarify, and hopefully the other person is willing to listen. But this is the root of a lot of our struggles with the double empathy problem. This concept refers to the tendency of neurotypicals to misread neurodivergence because of different social communication styles and vice versa. It goes both ways. However, living in a neurotypical ableist society, the fault is often laid at the feet of neurodivergence. Because neurotypicals are the majority, they create the rules, we're perceived to be breaking the rules, and therefore we're disrespecting them, and we're, behaving in socially unsanctioned ways, and we're deviants, and we have no respect for common social expectations. And the double empathy problem recognizes that, just because something is the default doesn't mean it should be all-encompassing. There are other points of view in the situation here. And what happens often, though, is the neurodivergent's feelings, needs, intentions, or their communication habits are eclipsed by this preference for neurotypical communication or social interaction styles. Unfortunately, that leads to a lot of oppression of neurodivergents who have to constantly be on their toes, watching out in social situations that they're not going to misstep, that they're following rules that were never explicitly explained to them, that they're not hurting other people's feelings, that they're not saying anything that could be in any way interpreted with a malicious intention. And I've encountered that so much as a neurodivergent, where I thought I was just stating fact, but I was being offensive, or being insensitive, or not respecting somebody's place in the social hierarchy, or I was threatening somebody's sense of power or control. All these things that happen that I don't necessarily feel responsible for, but I can take recognition of the fact that my actions or my words, behaviors have in some ways impacted people, and I can make an effort to clarify. But the thing that often makes me not want to try is that projection. If it feels like I'm constantly being projected upon by other people and their assumptions about my intentions without these clarifying questions happening, I just want to throw it all in and give up, because it's very demoralizing where it's like, hold on, how did you arrive at that conclusion? Oh, you're using your neurotypical senses about how this interaction is playing out and how it's played out before, and the assumption that, I must have an ulterior motive, or I must be, sneaking in some subtext into what I'm saying, that this observation is actually a slight or a snub or an attack on you. And they go and do this all of their own accord, and then form the narrative and get upset and hurt, and don't consult me until we're right at the end of the process when they're the damage is done and there's no chance for repair. And this is very frustrating, and it's why many neurodivergents just want to shut off and not even try, because why bother if that's always going to be the situation? And it's not always going to be. There are some people out there who are willing to consider other points of view, to be a bit more open-minded, to ask these clarifying questions. But for the most part, this is many neurodivergents' experience, and it's very dispiriting and makes us want to socially withdraw. Have you experienced this where a neurotypical person has projected a motive onto you or assumed something about you and not asked any clarifying questions, formed a narrative, and then come at you with their hurt, their anger, their frustration, treated you like you were disrespecting them or you were disregarding basic social conventions, and then behaved like it was some kind of moral offense? I would love to hear from you.